Thanks, Susan. I'm sorry, everyone. I think we're having a few sound difficulties, but hopefully you can hear me okay. Yes? All right, brilliant. I'd just like to add Susan's warm welcome to you all. It's a really exciting event, and I'm really excited to be presenting to you this morning. So I'm just going to show you my slides. Set these up here. Okay, so hopefully that should all work. As always, when we're talking about the future of education, technology never quite works how we want it to, but hopefully it will go slightly smoother for the rest of the day. Thanks so much again for inviting me to speak today. And as you know, and as Susan was just talking about, the conference theme is around the future of education. And I've just taken the kind of core themes that we're kind of encouraged to think about today. And so what I'd like to focus on today is something that I think is a really important issue, is the ways that education is increasingly being datafied, and how this has implications for what schools do and how we think about education. And although I think there's some real positives and potentials here for the use of data in education, I am concerned about the current direction of travel. And I want to share those concerns and potential ways forward with you. So in this talk, I'm essentially going to talk about three broad areas. In the first part, I really want to talk about the ways that digital trace data in particular is shaping educational research, policy and practice, raising questions about who holds expertise in this area, what counts as knowledge, and which groups of actors have the most power in this space. And then I want to kind of contrast some of those claims with the more practicalities and the realities of using this kind of data for research and practice based on my own experiences of working with data scientists in this space. I'm then going to go on to think about some of the key social and educational implications of the use of this kind of data, thinking about what these instances of using data in education actually means qualitatively for schools. And then I want to talk in the final part of the presentation about how we as a kind of community might really want to influence the future direction of travel in how we use this data. I think it's really exciting. I think it's got lots of potential, but I think we might want to design alternative futures using this kind of data, thinking about it in quite a different kind of way. I also want to stress here that much of my work is based in the UK, and so it tends to have quite a European, North American focus. And so I'd be really interested to talk about in the Q&A about how these themes or issues are similar or entirely different in other parts of the world. And I'm really excited about the range of talks today and the range of discussions about the future that we're going to be having. And I think the other keynote at the end of the day by Lucy and Angelina Camfed will provide a really important and kind of complementary discussion to the themes that I'm going to be talking about. Because I think when we're talking about the future of education, of course, this is a global question and a kind of global endeavour. Okay, so of course, one of the key questions we have to think about first of all is what I actually mean by datafication. So when I'm talking about the datafication of education, I'm arguing that, like in other areas of social life, data is becoming a defining feature of learning and education. And it's increasingly seen as a way of defining and potentially solving many educational challenges. From your own experiences and both within education and perhaps in your policy and practice roles, we can also see two broad types of data being used in education at the moment. And so the first is the data that we're perhaps more comfortable and more familiar with. This is more the increasing focus of the collection of data at national and international levels, ranging from demographic data on students, school expenditure, high stakes or summative assessments in an array of subjects and life stages. And examples of this would be PISA. In the UK, we have the National Pupil Database. And these data sets are in some ways very big. The National Pupil Database comprises of over 7 million, 8 million data points. But I want to talk about a different kind of data that is also very big in scope, but also very big in nature and in terms of its qualitative properties. So at the same time as we're collecting more of this kind of data, we're also collecting due to the increased use of digital technologies for learning, both within and outside schools and formal settings of education, an increasing amount of real-time, fine-grained data that can be collected and potentially tell us something about learning and educational processes. Every keystroke we make, every click, the time we spend watching the screen, our location data, our engagements with others are all just some of the examples of the micro level data that can now be collected by social network sites, for example, like Twitter, the games that have been designed for learning and indeed for pleasure, learning management systems, virtual learning environments, and so on. We can think of multiple different technologies that we engage with on a daily basis for education. And so it's this second type of data, sometimes called big data, that I'd really like to focus on today, because it offers us some quite different opportunities and challenges to this first kind of data that I spoke about. Although, of course, you could put both into one design, and I'm quite interested in that. And you might ask, well, Rebecca, we're talking about the future of education. Why focus on big data or digital trace data? Should we not be talking about artificial intelligence? That seems to be the buzzword at the moment. And it is true, AI is really exciting at the moment, and much of my work looks at these questions. But it's important to remember that the kinds of data that form the basis of many of the advances in AI is the kind of data that I'm talking about. So to me, it's a really important way in. It's a kind of lens that we can apply to thinking about technological advances in education and the kinds of priorities and kind of power networks that we have around those data systems. It's like a really important way in to studying this phenomenon. So just to give a bit more background to that, so once this data is collected and analysed, what does it get used for? So for the most part, a lot of this data is used in schools to understand, detect and intervene in learning in some way. And we have kind of two broad types of data-intensive systems that we see. So in some cases, data might be used as part of an automated teaching and learning system. So these would be adaptive assessments or intelligent tutoring systems. And the other broad approach is to use this data as a basis of systems to help inform decision making, either on the part of students or teachers. These could be, for example, the visualizations that we might see in our learning management systems or our virtual learning environments. And this second type of data can be retrospective, so it might collate our activities in terms of our lecture views, for example, over the term, or the number of books we've accessed in the library. But increasingly, those systems are quite predictive in nature. So based on that behaviour, there are also assumptions or predictions about whether these students will drop out, who's likely to pass the exam, and so on. Although learning, I would say, is a core part of using this data for schools, and there's also a growing number of broader purposes as well, for example, in terms of informing resource allocation, timetabling, and I think crucially, and something I'll probably come back to, is in terms of evaluating interventions, accountability, measuring teacher effectiveness, and these kind of wider parts of education that are, of course, also really important. So I've just put up this slide here as an example of just some of the many companies that are out there supporting or offering data-intensive systems in education. And I'm sure you recognise at least some of the logos there. And this is just a visual of edtech startups. This is not a complete list. There are thousands of companies now working in this area across the globe, from startups to really well-established companies like Pearson, Microsoft, Apple, Google, and so on. So there's this increasing array of products, particularly designed and produced by the commercial sector. And when we start to think about it, much of our use of this data is sometimes quite hidden in our practice, but it's very prevalent, in fact, in many schools, in many settings. So as I said, I think it's important to think about the specifics of this data, what this data actually offers us that's distinctive to other forms of data. And one way of thinking about this is this definition that's provided by Rob Kitchen, who I find quite useful. And there are multiple different definitions of digital trace data or big data, but this is one that I find quite useful. And really what this definition highlights for me is the way that this data is different in nature to the data we've been able to collect about learning and education before, not just in terms of the volume of the data points we can collect, but also that it's collected in real time, that it's very fine-grained, and it can take a variety of different forms, and some would argue it's exhaustive. So before I want to sort of talk about what that might offer us in practical terms, I want to sort of stress that this idea of digital trace data, this idea of big data, has quite significant social implications as well. So big data isn't just one thing. It's not just about the fact it's a different kind of data. It also represents a different way of thinking about education and the social sciences, and indeed how all of society should be working. So, for example, Kate Crawford, who talks a lot in this space and has written wonderful articles about big data, talks about big data as theory, as practice, as archive, myth, and rhetorical move. So sort of capturing how big data isn't just about the data, it's this wider social cultural implications as well. And big data, as Annette Markham also talks about, functions as this very powerful frame for discourse about knowledge. So we can start to see how these wider discourses about big data are likely to influence our thoughts about education. So when ideas of big data first started gaining attention, many argued that this was going to be the end of the need for theory. And I love this quote. It's an old quote, but it's a very famous one by Chris Anderson, who was then the editor of Wired magazine. And he argued the end of social science. There is now no better way. Petabytes allow us to say correlation is enough. We can stop looking for models. We can analyze the data without hypotheses about what it might show. We can throw the numbers into the biggest computing clusters the world has ever seen and let statistical algorithms find patterns where science cannot. And so for a time, this argument about the end of theory was really popular. And while most of us now recognize that we do still need theory to guide our assumptions, to guide our research, and we still need social science, it's not the end of it. It indicates a kind of belief in the power of this data. And it also perhaps prioritizes quite a positivist view of understanding the world over other ontological viewpoints. And we should think here a little bit about why is it called big data when really it is more accurately digital trace data. And it's because digital trace data isn't in any way as compelling or as easy to sell as this kind of notion of big data, this all-powerful data. And indeed, if you look at how big data is being discussed in education, big data is sort of positioned as this solution for education. And this is a great quote from one of the founders of Old School, talking about how we need to generate the big data and then we can transform education. And Old School was set up by people primarily from Google. And they set up these schools in the US where students were recorded, all the technologies they engaged with, video recordings of their practices. And for a while, they were reasonably successful, but then parents became very concerned about the kind of surveillance aspects of the schools and weren't really seeing the transformation of education that they were promised. And so Old School has now pivoted to altitude learning, and they've also started to employ some educational theorists. So it perhaps suggests that maybe solving all of our educational problems straightforwardly through data is perhaps not entirely possible. But that said, just given the sizes of some of these data sets remains a very powerful discourse. It sort of becomes the way to convince others that the research using big data and large numbers is somehow more meaningful than findings from research that is less number-centric. And this is just one of my favorite examples of this, which is a paper from Facebook and a team of academics where the size of the data involved in the experiment seems more important than the actual findings from the study. I also just want to note here the really strong presence of the commercial sector. Recent estimates suggest that the edtech market is worth around $100 billion in the last year. And of course, with the pandemic, this market share is just growing year on year. But But what we see is the ways that this data is being taken up and spoken about is very much influenced by the commercial sector. And Stephen Ball, for example, writes a lot about how this kind of network effect occurs. And they have both a discursive and practical influence on policy. So they might also offer advisory roles to governments. They will also promote particular tools with particular kinds of discourse around them, but they also are primarily responsible for designing systems and offering the analytic expertise that they say schools now require. So they kind of are involved in all stages of the process and framing that in a particular kind of way. And for me, this has quite significant implications for the values and purposes of education, because it encourages a view of schooling as needing to serve the needs of the economy, which is a kind of common sense view of education, rather than a kind of wider democratic view of education that is so important for the health of society. And it also encourages us to think so much about measurement and processes and accuracy, but stops us talking about what we hope education to achieve, a kind of more philosophical perspective. So trying to kind of step back from the rhetoric and some of the kind of wider social forces that we're seeing, can big data help us understand learning and education in more research-based terms? And I think definitely, I think this data as a researcher is really exciting. The possibilities of getting this very fine-grained, microscopic level of data about how people engage with technologies and learn with technologies longitudinally, I think, is very exciting and promising. It makes processes of the aspects of the learning process much more visible than was possible before, and might enable us to capture things that happen outside formal educational contexts or outside our kind of usual systems of observation, which could be really useful and powerful. So I think, it is exciting. I think there are some real big promises here, but also, just like with all kinds of data, there are some challenges as well. And these are my top 5 based on my experiences of working with data scientists. And they range in terms of challenges with the construction of data. So really trying to recognize that this data isn't neutral. It's entirely shaped by the designs of the systems that we have in place. Thinking about how we operationalize theory and metrics through these systems. How do we measure things like engagement? How do we know learning happens from these patterns of behavior? Sometimes it's quite difficult to see how this very messy data can relate into kind of learning and educational concepts. A big issue perhaps is the narrowing of measurement, measuring only what is possible to measure through these systems rather than measuring what we think is important in education. And another big issue is the fact that while we think we have all of this data, this massive data set, there are problems with that data. There are gaps in who's represented. So those who tend to be noisier online, who tend to be better connected, will be more visible in the data, and therefore the data models created will better represent them. And so there are risks there about biases being built into the systems that we create. And the 5th one is around data boundaries, simply noticing that how people learn with digital tools, you don't tend to just use one platform, you might move from one to another. And for researchers, it's very hard to capture the data across all of these different systems. You tend to only have one. So we see then this development of a very complex ecology. There's a kind of complex network of people working around the space in data and education, and thinking about how we should be using data in schools and other educational institutions. And I think we're seeing really a very important shift in the ways, in the power really, in who's deciding what direction we should be going in. So companies engaged in this space hold significant amounts of data about learning and education, perhaps not the best data, but probably the most data than compared even now to national governments, I would argue. And the people who are being prioritized or positioned as experts in this space are those who can use this data. So the computer scientists, the physicists, the engineers. And so both those groups, companies and data scientists, have their own expertise and their own motivations, but they don't know sufficient amounts about education, I would argue. And so are we seeing a trajectory that we want for education? Is there enough of a conversation between the education community and these other groups? And I think possibly not. So taking it down a little bit from this more sociological perspective and thinking about it a little bit more in terms of what does it mean in practice? What are the qualitative implications in the classroom? And what's really interesting is that while learning and education is increasingly characterized by the use of these tools, we're seeing very little rich data, rich research evidence about how interacting with such systems might be changing the experiences of learning or the nature of education. So there is some research in this area and it is growing, but we definitely need, for example, some really rich ethnographies in this space, I think. So just to give some examples in this talk, for example, in the context of writing, using data-driven systems to assess writing. So often when you read the literature on this, you'll see a lot of debate about, well, can a data system be as accurate as a human marker? This is a big question within learning analytics. But while some work has shown, that automated systems can be equivalently as good as a human marker, there are other indications that students are changing their writing practices as a result of being assessed by these systems. So a classic example of this is from quite small-scale qualitative research, which shows how the use of plagiarism software in countries like the UK. So for example, when a student writes an essay, it's checked by plagiarism software like Turnitin. And if it looks like another piece of work or is too close to another piece of work, it gets flagged and a human has to kind of assess if plagiarism has happened. And so what's happening, because students are so concerned about being accused of plagiarism, is rather than write in their own words, they're tending to use more direct quotes in order to kind of remove the risk of these systems accusing them of cheating. And I also think there's a kind of bigger question here that is really important, is how these technologies are changing the relationship between teacher and student. So education, that relationship is hugely important. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but that's a kind of core principle of what education is about. So if you intervene in that relationship, what does that do? And we really haven't thought carefully enough, I think, about what those relationships and those dynamics look like. And I really like this quote by Audrey Waters, who's a great commentator on all things EdTech and AI. And she says, what does it mean to tell our students that we're not actually going to read their papers, but we're going to scan them and a computer will analyze them instead? What happens when we encourage students to express themselves in a way that appeases the robot essay graders rather than a human audience? And I really think we really need to think philosophically about what does that do to people's experiences of education and indeed the outcomes of education. Another issue that I think is really important is how much these systems risk compounding existing inequalities in our educational systems. And these can be seen in different moments. So at the school level, for example, there are concerns. There have always been concerns about schools with more resources being able to use technology in more creative ways, for example, than schools with less resources. And now there are concerns that those schools with better resources are able to kind of use these algorithmic systems in ways that benefit them and enhance the educational offer, whereas in less well-resourced schools, they're being used to cut costs or replace teachers and are kind of almost dictating the educational experience for those students. And so some have started to talk about a kind of issue around educational redlining, where we're seeing quite different experiences in what people can have access to and how they're learning with these systems. And an example of this would be massive open online courses, where those who are able to pay to engage with MOOCs tend to have some kind of human interaction at some point, whereas those who take the free option are very much encountering the kind of AI bot version of the MOOC, because it's cheaper to do that once things are set up. So there are kind of concerns around at the school level, but there are also concerns, as I mentioned before, about the biases within these systems, sometimes biases that we don't see or don't pay attention to. And these can happen at a number of different stages when we build data models. And that's partly because when we build data models, we are using past data and what tends to happen to students in order to assume and predict what's going to happen to the next cohort of students. So if we already have lots of bias in our education systems, which of course we do, then these existing inequalities are built into these systems and they continue to perpetuate that problem. There are other problems, as I said before, around the kinds of people who are best represented in these data models. And also there's the implicit biases of those who are building these models, the kind of common sense assumptions people might have about education and the implicit biases that we all hold and should be far more aware of, and how these then influence the final models that are then put into educational practice. We also have to think about who's subjected to the analysis of big data systems. So in general, as big data is being used to kind of solve education problems and solve social problems, we see that often the people who are most targeted by these systems tend to be those who are more marginalized and less well off. And this happens in all sorts of areas of social life. And in education, we see a kind of strong focus on identifying underperformers or those at risk of dropout or those who are underachievers. And so once labelled as such, then these students will get a particular kind of attention. Now that attention could be very positive, it could be a very positive intervention, but often it can be around narrowing the curriculum, narrowing their experience in order to make sure they pass an exam. So I've just put here an example in the UK of very young children, primary school aged around 5 or 6, who were excluded from arts-based courses in order to pass their literacy exams. And again, this has questions about, well, you know, what does that do in our education systems? Who is benefiting most from their educational experiences? So in the final part of this presentation, I know I haven't got that many minutes left, I'd like to talk about how we as a community can shape the direction of the future of digital trace data in order to sort of create the educational futures that we want. And I think it's a really important moment to do that. You know, I think the COVID pandemic has really thrown light on the importance of schooling again, and it's really told us about the complex role that schools play in society. And it's also made visible, you know, a whole range of social, educational and technological inequalities. And I think at the same time, teachers and students have had to use digital technologies and data intense systems in ways they didn't have to before. And all of this together may mean that we have a better understanding of the kind of education we might want in the future, but also a kind of, for teachers and educational professionals, more of a sense of agency over the kind of technology they want. It's no longer about teachers just being not technically skilled. It's now perhaps about the offer not being good enough for what teachers want for their students. And so I think we should perhaps use this moment as a really important one to for change and for change in the future of education. So based on this complex context, I'd really like to sort of think about the sort of elements of the way forward. And here's just a few things that I think are really important. So one is to really think about this data as a complement to existing possibilities of the data that we can kind of use and the things that we can design. It's not a replacement or any kind of significant ontological shift. And although data doesn't do everything it promises, and it sometimes does things that are really not so great, I think we really have to, as an educational community, engage with it and try and change things for two main reasons. So first, I think, as I've said, I actually think this data could allow us to have new and innovative insights, but also because I think if we don't engage with it, then the future of big data in education is going to be decided by others without the significant expertise and experience of all of us. And I think that would be very problematic. And so one of the ways that I think this could be focused on is in terms of participatory design, but also in terms of digital literacies. But before I talk briefly about both of those things, I just want to talk about a few things that I think we might want to be thinking about when we're thinking about digital trace data in education and designing for the future. So the first thing I think is a really big question around how can we build systems that support agency for both students and teachers. So we have this kind of problem at the moment that these systems risk students and teachers feeling like they have a lack of expertise or lack of control over the learning and teaching process. Because of this kind of belief that these systems have all the answers. And I think we really need to come to a position where people feel they can argue with the data, that the data is just one representation of a very complex phenomenon, and to kind of encourage a better engagement. We're very good at arguing, for example, with or laughing at Amazon recommendations, for example, or arguing with Google Maps when it takes us the wrong direction. So why can't we argue with data in education in a similar way? And in order to support agency, we really need to think about how we can augment our possibilities rather than just replace. There's a very strong focus on replacing teacher activities with technology. But what we should be doing is augmenting teacher practices, augmenting education through the use of these digital systems. So really allowing a kind of very different way of building a future that enables something bigger than the sum of the parts, rather than simply replacing parts of the existing system. And thirdly, I'm interested in focusing on the use of big data, not just for the learning sciences, but also a kind of wider set of questions around the sociology of education. And this could take a number of different forms. I've just put up a paper there that I've recently been involved with colleagues at MIT, but to really start to use that data to make visible existing inequalities in education. For example, in this paper, we were looking at the problems and biases in school choice sites, often seen as something that makes it more likely to get more equal education, but in fact contains very biased information. And so I think this kind of sociology of education and big data is really important. So these are just some of the things I'm interested in, and I'm conscious of time. But regardless of how this area develops in the future, I think participatory approaches is going to be really important, not just because we can then make use of all the different sources of expertise I've talked about, but also to raise the debate in this area and ensure that we all own our decisions being made in this area. And it's a brilliant way of sort of developing theory and practice over time to develop education in the ways that we want to do that. And of course, it's never perfect, it's not a straightforward solution, but I think it's a really important part of that. And related to this is, of course, around data literacies and really ensuring students have control and understanding of their data. But not just that, it's also about them having a kind of ability to engage and change the ways that data in education is being used and envisaged. So it's really about learning to actually design things for themselves and create things. I think is a really important part of data literacies. And of course, it's not just about young people, it's about all of us, but I think that's an important start. So in closing then, what I've tried to argue in this talk is that I think data is becoming a defining feature of our educational system. But big data or digital trace data needs to be understood as a really complex artifact. It's both technical, social, and cultural. And you have to think about all of those things in one element. It's currently framed in a very strong kind of way that supports the marketization of schooling as a way to solve educational challenges. And all of this framing is coming from outside of education. I think there's lots of implications of using this data, and it's going to be from individual experience all the way up to the school systems. And I think some of these risks are, increasing inequalities or at least compounding inequalities in our existing systems. So I think change is really important. So I think if we wish to continue to use digital trace data within our education systems, it's really important to start to reconfigure this whole conversation and the ways that it's starting to be used across the educational system. I think Gert Biester has a really nice article that really reminds us of what are the purposes of schools. Are they there just to meet the needs of society, or should they be set apart from society to allow them to actually, facilitate change, make change in the future? And of course, schools should be doing both, but it does feel at the moment like it's veering towards one side of that argument. And possibilities to change seems more challenging. But despite that, I do it's possible there. Here are some of the references that I used throughout this talk, and do feel free to get in contact if you'd like to know more or ask any questions. Thank you.